Thank you.
Okay. Then we will continue with Marijke van Kuijk. The title of her presentation is Subsistence Hunting in Indigenous Forest Villages of Suriname. Marijke, please, the floor is yours.
Yes. So I think you can all see the slides now, right? And you can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So thanks, Hans, for inviting me to this seminar. I'm very happy that I can show some of my work here in that I do in Suriname. So today I will present some of the research that I do with the PhD student on the social ecological system of crop breeding. And this is actually a very interdisciplinary research where we combine ecological and social sciences. So there are also multiple supervisors in this project. So I'm mainly there for the ecological part, and I have a colleague who is working on the social part. So we are with multiple supervisors, and Lisbeth Sterk, who's also in the room today, she is also one of the supervisors of this PhD project. And the PhD student is Ronja Knippers, but she is in New Aurora as we speak, so she cannot present today herself. So I'm presenting for her. And this project is actually a collaboration between Utrecht University, Tropenbos Suriname, the Amazon Conservation Team of Suriname, and the Vereniging van Samakaanse Gezagsdragers. So in most of the villages, we work closely with the Amazon Conservation Team, but in New Aurora, we also work with Tropenbos and the VSG. Can you see the slides moving? Yes, you can, right?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So I work in Utrecht University as an associate professor, and I focus mainly on plant-animal interactions. And I do this in various places, among others, also in French Guiana. And here I focus on seed dispersal processes and browsing processes and how these are impacted when hunting occurs. So when there's a lot of hunting, obviously many species or individuals are disappearing, but also functional traits are disappearing from the ecosystem. And we study how the impact of this trait loss or changes in traits affects the trait composition of seeds and seedlings. So we do this mainly in French Guiana, but also in Brazil, we have a similar approach, but the forest there is very different. So in Brazil, we work in the Atlantic forest, which is highly fragmented, unlike the forest in the Guianas. So in Brazil, we study in fragments how seed dispersal networks are developing with age of fragments and connectivity of forest fragments. So we have a similar approach, but then in a completely different setting. And then in Suriname, I work on crop breeding, which is a different type of plant-animal interaction. And crop breeding, of course, you cannot ignore social sciences when you study something related to human-wildlife interactions. So this is why this research is so interdisciplinary. As you are all aware, we have to increasingly share our landscapes with wildlife, and wildlife increasingly has to share it with us. And this leads to a lot of conflicts between humans and wildlife, and some very famous examples. You can think of, for instance, elephants killing a lot of crops, killing people even, or tigers or baboons harassing people. So these are very clear conflicts that are well known to a lot of people. But there's also a smaller group a group of smaller crop breeders, like the ones we study in Suriname, that actually cause a lot of damage to food by foraging on the crops, uprooting them or trampling them, destroying them in general. And this has received actually a lot less attention, and especially not in South America or Suriname. So a lot of the research is focused on, that is on human-wildlife conflicts, is focusing on Africa and Asia and Europe even, but not on South America or the Guianas. So a lot of studies are actually also on the mitigation measures that can be taken to avoid human-wildlife conflicts. But some of them are actually only mildly effective or temporarily effective. And they also do not take into account the root causes of conflicts and also actually the perceptions that people have of these conflicts. So the social side of conflicts. So this leads to actually decreased wildlife tolerance by people, and tolerance can be defined as the willingness to accept the presence and impact of wildlife. And also we would like to study in Suriname, we would like to study the tolerance of people towards wildlife and what determines the tolerance. And in the end, we would like to go from conflict to coexistence. And coexistence, in our case, is defined as the willingness to share the landscape with wildlife, including actually also sustainable mitigation measures. Now, to be able to achieve this, you need to have a good stakeholder participation and also interdisciplinary research, as I've already mentioned a few times. So you cannot do this with ecology alone. And so far, a lot of the research on wildlife conflicts have been approached from the ecological side. So in this research, we, like I said, we have a social component and the ecological component. On the right, you see the part that is more about the ecology. So we study predator abundance and predator activity, and we try to formulate a landscape of fear for crop raiders. And together with wild food availability and cultivated food availability, this determines to what extent crop raiders actually raid crops. So how often they do it and how severely they do it. The social component of this research focuses more on the side of humans. So we study their social cultural perceptions of conflicts and also how this determines the tolerance to wildlife. And this, of course, is also determined by the costs and the benefits that people have from the presence of this wildlife. And this causes how people behave and how abundant they are in the forest. And at its turn, human abundance and activity also plays a part in the landscape of fear of animals. So we did a preliminary study in 22, I think it was. So somebody went to a lot of villages for a different reason. We asked this person to do some interviews about crop raiding, which is what he did. And he found out that in most of the villages, people are having some problems with peccaries, the collared and the white-lipped peccaries, with agouti, with paca, and with the brocket deer. And these were the species that were listed as typical crop raiders and the people were having some troubles with. Now, because we also want to study the cultural perceptions, or the influence of culture on perceptions of people, we decided to select 2 maroon villages and 2 indigenous villages. And for various reasons, we came to New Aurora, the cluster of Matawai villages, Apatina and Sipaluini, all the way in the south. So 2 indigenous and 2 maroon. And this is where we do our studies. And I would like to show you a few pictures of how beautiful it is there. So on the left, you see a picture taken from the office or the house of the Amazon conservation team at the river. It's really beautiful. On the right, you actually also see a non-crop raider coming to the crop fields. So there are actually also huge predators walking around these crop fields, which could cause another conflict, but not the ones we are focusing on in this study. So the setup is roughly the same in all of these villages that we study. So close to the river, you see where people have built their houses. And we start our grid, we call it a grid, on the edge of where the villages go, where the houses actually become forest again. And we include also agricultural plots in our grid. And this grid, we do all of our measurements in this grid. We study animal populations with camera traps. So each grid cell has a camera trap in it. Some of the grid cells have agricultural fields in them. And the white line in the middle indicates, we call it a fruit trail. And this is a trail that we walk regularly every month to determine what the wild food availability for crop raiders is. So we have determined by using literature what crop raiders eat, and we measure the availability of this food along this white line. And on top of that, we also measure the food availability in the agricultural plots. So each month we also go to the crop fields and we check the food availability for crop raiders and also the damage that they have done to the crops. So a lot of that work is now taking place in New Aurora. We've already measured there for a little bit more than a year. Same for Matawai. And last September, we set up this grid in Apatina and Sipaliwini. And we are now having a second season there. So the PhD student that I mentioned, Ronja, she will go there in a few weeks to these two villages to change the setup of the camera traps and do interviews. So, like I said, we monitor the animals with camera traps. So we study their abundance, but also we try to study their behavior by studying vigilance. So that would that will say something about how they perceive fear in the landscape that they live in. On the top left, you see Uncle Sam, he's called, and he's helping us with identifying food sources for crop raiders and identifying tree species to so that we can identify species level. In the bottom left, you see a student who is measuring crop damage in one of the cassava fields, and on the in the middle, in the bottom, you see the damage that is done by I think an agouti in this case, who are really uprooting and destroying a lot of the crops. So besides this ecological work on plants and food, we also have a lot of interviews that we did in all of these villages. We used the wildlife tolerance model. You can see that on the top right. It's very small, so you cannot probably read what is in it. But this is a model that has been developed by a researcher in South Africa, and she developed a framework by which you can research which factors determine the tolerance of people towards wildlife. And these include very tangible factors like encounters with wildlife or economic losses due to wildlife, but also more intangible factors like the attitude or the feeling that people have with animals. So by doing lots and lots of interviews, you can say something about the factors that determine tolerance of people. And we did this in several sessions, like the group sessions you see on the left and the top. But we also had individual interviews with people on the right, in the bottom, where we would interview people who owned crop fields, and we asked them about what animals would go to their fields, how often, how much damage they would do, so how many crops were lost by these animals. We also asked them about their perceptions towards animals, and we also asked about mitigation measures, if they tried it and if it worked or not. So we asked a lot of questions, and I would like to share some first results. So we are still analyzing the interview data. Actually, we're still doing interviews even. So this is very first glance of the results that come out of the interviews. So what we found is that empathy, so emotional feelings towards animals, play actually a larger role in tolerance than economic losses. And before we started this research, we actually thought it would be economic losses that would really be the top factor determining tolerance, but it's actually empathy. So this is something that we did not expect, but it's also found in other studies that use the wildlife tolerance model around the world. We also found that indigenous people generally show lower willingness to tolerate damage than maroon people. And we have some ideas about why this is the case. And we think maybe animism might play a role. And we, during the interviews, we noticed that animism is more prevalent in maroon cultures than in indigenous cultures. It is actually also present in indigenous cultures, but maybe because of the influence of religion, this has become a little bit less than in the maroon cultures, but we're not sure. Also, income, we think, might play a role because indigenous people have a lower income in general than maroon people. We also asked people we interviewed about income. And also the connection to Paramaribo might play a role because the maroon villages that we work in are quite well connected to Paramaribo. Some people even live in Paramaribo for a couple of months per year, and they have easier access to other food sources and also actually access to other beliefs and other ways of thinking about animals than people who live in the indigenous villages. We also noticed that women have a lower tolerance than men towards increasing animal populations, and this might have to do with the fact that it's the women who do the work on the crop fields. So they are the ones that actually encounter the damage by wildlife very often, every day, while the men actually perceive encountering wildlife more as something positive, because if they encounter wildlife, they may be hunting and shoot it, and then they have meat to eat. So this is a different way of perceiving encountering animals. So women have a lower tolerance than men. Peccaries are the least tolerated of all the species that we are researching, because they often come in groups and cause much damage to the crops. So even though they don't visit the crop fields that often, when they come with multiple individuals. So for instance, the white-lipped peccary, they often have groups of 80 or 90 or 100 individuals. So when they come to your field will be completely destroyed. Well, if there's an agouti or a brocadier, they might destroy some plants, but not all of the crop field. So peccaries are perceived as least favored by people. We also heard people saying that they feel that crop raiding has increased over the past couple of years because of the increased abundance of animals. So not so much because of the increase in damage, but because of really the increase in abundance. And they feel that this has to do with the fact that there's a lot of logging and mining within their vicinity. And some of the logging is actually targeting fruiting trees. So they feel that there's less fruit available in the forest for these wild animals. That's why they come to the crop fields to eat. They also feel that the activity of animals has become more unpredictable. So a couple of years ago, it would be easier for them to predict when crop raiders would be active, and it would also be easier to then take precautions, for instance, chasing them away or having patrol sessions. But now their activity pattern has become more unpredictable. They also noticed that animals are increasingly foraging on young plants and unripe crops, while this did not happen a couple of years ago. So they see a shift in that. Of course, due to this, they face economic losses, mental stress, and higher food insecurity. And all these disservices are actually outweighing the benefits. And the major benefit of having crop raiders is the meat provisioning. So they provide meat. So even though some people consider it positive that the animals come to them instead of they having to go to the animals to hunt them, the disservices that they experience are outweighing the benefits of crop raiders. So we also interviewed about mitigation measures that people are taking, but they feel it is all not so effective because there are policy decisions being made, like I said, about mining and logging in their areas that affect crop raiding. And this is major. This is something that they cannot mitigate by just having a fence around their crops, for instance. That this doesn't work. They also say that animals show cognitive behavior. So after having seen a scarecrow, for instance, a couple of times, animals know that this is not really a scary thing, it's not really a threat, so they will just come to the fields anyway. Also, a lot of mitigation measures are out of reach for many people because you need materials and money and time and knowledge of how to implement these measures, and this is not available to them. They have no trust at all in the government, but they do have a large trust in NGOs, and it's actually also the NGOs that provide some training and materials for mitigation measures, but not really on a large scale, or not yet. We also saw that there is some conflict between village inhabitants. So sometimes, especially the women, they feel that they suffer more from crop raiding than men because they are the ones that are experiencing it all the time. And they also feel that sometimes the benefits of having wildlife around goes to men instead of to them, while they are the ones that having to bear the losses of the crops. So some preliminary conclusions that we can draw from these interviews is that actually transformative changes are needed to address the root causes of this conflict. So this would, for instance, include policy changes, so changes in land use related to mining and logging, and also education. But what people actually need and what they want are incremental changes, so direct changes addressing the symptoms of the conflict. For instance, physical barriers, compensation schemes, or something else, true mitigation measures that work and that are long-lasting and that they know how to use. So on the left, you see an example of CD discs. People have been trying this. They also have been using light to scare animals away. But what they actually need is something more high-tech and something more sustainable. So to overcome the gap between these short-term changes and long-term changes that are actually needed, we need to make sure that changes are done gradually, that it is always done in collaboration with people, because if you are not involving people well enough, none of these mitigation measures will work. And clear communication is very important. And what we will conclude from our study, once it is finally done, I think we can safely say that cultural context is very important, and that needs to be accounted for in any kind of solution that you will offer for human-wildlife conflicts. I would like to end with, by now, quite a famous picture that we use a lot because it's so typical, an agouti stealing a plantain. And actually, we've also heard people say that they don't mind that animals eat some of their crops. They just don't want them to eat all of their crops. But they do understand that animals also have to eat, and that they are being chased away from their forest by the miners and the loggers, and that they are welcome on the crop fields, but only to a small extent. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marijke. So, are there any questions for Marijke?
Yeah, I have a question, Marijke. You mentioned the concept of landscape of fear. Can you say a little bit more about it? What does that entail, and could you even apply it to humans, or?
Yeah, so the landscape of fear was mostly thought of as fear for predators, for animal predators, but we have included humans also as a factor that might influence landscape of fear. But the difficult thing is that we are using camera traps, so not videos, but photos. And we are trying to see vigilance behavior of these photos. And that's not always so obvious. So for the deer, it's a bit more obvious because when they lift their head, for instance, they are more cautious, or when they are looking around. But for paca and agouti, this is all quite difficult still. It hasn't been done by anyone before. So we are trying to find out what indicates vigilant behavior with these animals.
And then a landscape of fear is then the overall picture of all factors that may cause fear and to what extent?
Yes.
Or yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And in a way, maybe as a starting point to mitigate or to do something.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
Okay,
so because animals show cognitive behavior, you might also think of solutions where you actually learn animals to maybe, that this is what a lady told us in the forest. She said, I'm even willing to put up a small garden for the animals, as long as I know that they will eat there and I keep my other crops for me and my kids, then I will be willing to provide some food for the animals. So that made us think, well, what if you can learn the animals to go indeed to that field so that it stays away from the other fields? That would be perfect, but it's not there yet, of course. But this started us to think about the cognitive behavior of animals and what we can do to use their abilities in this context.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Then we have Daniel.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I had a question about the animistic beliefs. Can you elaborate a bit more how they affect the way people intrusive animals, like how does it shape their actions towards them?
Yeah, so it wasn't a question in one of our interviews. It just popped up during some of the interviews, but we didn't specifically ask about it. So we didn't research it that well. It just came up a couple of times. And what you notice is that some people believe that some animals have a spirit or a soul, just like humans, or some people even believe that some species contain spirits from ancestors. So they have some, like a different way of looking at certain animal species. But this is all quite specific, also within the group of Maroons and within the group of indigenous people. So we now all compile them as if they were one homogeneous group. Of course, they are not. So if you want to research this more, I would say you will really need to focus on this also a lot more, and to also clearly make distinctions within the group of indigenous people and within the group of Maroon people. So I cannot say too much about it now, but we did notice a couple of times that people were not feeling comfortable with killing animals just because they also need food, or killing animals because they were of a certain species.
Yeah, so is it specific species? I can imagine that, for example, agoutis are seen differently than boa constrictor, for example.
Yeah, it's mostly primates, some primates that they have these feelings with, and not so much with the other species. I haven't heard that. Certainly not with agouti. Agouti is easy food, so it's not. They don't have those feelings with agoutis.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We'll do a last question. Tinder, I see you have raised your hand.
Yes, Marijke, very, very interesting research. And it really, we found a little bit the same when we were doing the rice research.
Yeah.
Of course, birds, they love rice and they eat quite some rice. But people don't really kill them. If you have a shotgun, you could kill them all, especially the bigger species. But people also say, no, they can eat a little bit. And they even plant some of the black rice on the side of the forest, which is then for the birds. Or for the spirits. And we didn't understand that because it's a waste of time. But then we asked and we asked and we asked, and John Jackson is somewhere in the audience, so he knows because he did some asking for us. But people said it is probably because birds in the past dispersed black rice, and people found it in the wild. So also thanks to the birds, they have found some crops. So they say a sort of thank you to the birds, and the birds is the forest and is the forest spirit. It took us forever to find out, but I can send you the paper that Nicolaas published in Human Ecology. Yeah, because this is an attitude that
and we also noticed a lot that almost none of the people were like to shoot the animals. You know, they of course they need to shoot them to have food, but they all said they felt sorry for the animals, that they were being chased away from the forest, and they all see that animals belong to the forest and they are the forest. And also with birds, indeed, and leafcutter ants. Leafcutter ants are also causing major problems. And one lady even suggested that maybe they should change their diets into birds. So she said, if birds become a nuisance, we just have to start eating them, she said. So I'm not sure if that is the solution, but yeah, it's very similar to what you're describing.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.